on the plane coming here because I do feel like, yeah, I think we gotta change the narrative.
She started hearing things, whispers about backroom deals, quiet favors, and the kind of industry alliances that could make or break a career. To most people, Meek Mill's rise from Philadelphia's streets to rubbing shoulders with billionaires looked like a victory story. But to Milan, it began to look like something else, a web of power where every cosign came with a price. And every courtroom win might have had strings attached. And as those whispers grew louder, Milan realized she wasn't just dating a rapper. She was standing next to a man whose entire life had become entangled in forces much bigger than either of them. She couldn't ignore what she was hearing. The stories were too consistent, too detailed, and they came from people who had no reason to lie. Whispers of dimly lit gatherings. Industry mentors watching closely as boundaries got pushed further and further. And artists who came out on the other side, changed, some with careers that skyrocketed. Others who disappeared from the spotlight entirely. For Milan, the turning point wasn't about catching Meek in the act, it was about realizing the world she had stepped into wasn't just about music, fashion, or love. It was about power, leverage, and control. Insiders claim she started journaling everything she heard, connecting dots, keeping receipts, not to expose Meek, but to protect herself in case the spotlight ever turned her way. And while the public saw a poised entrepreneur running a successful brand, behind the scenes Milan was quietly carrying the weight of secrets that could shake the very foundation of the industry. And that's what makes this moment different. Milan isn't speaking as a bitter ex or someone chasing a headline, she's speaking as a witness. A woman who sat quietly long enough to understand how the game is played, and who now feels the cost of that silence might be heavier than the fallout of telling the truth. What she's hinting at isn't just about one man or one relationship, it's about a machine, a system where rising stars are filtered, tested, and molded in ways the public never sees. Where training sessions blur into trauma. And loyalty is measured by how much you're willing to endure without breaking. For years, people have whispered about these rituals, these rooms, these men who decide who makes it and who fades out. But if Milan really pulls back the curtain, it won't just be gossip anymore. It'll be testimony. And in an industry built on silence and protection, testimony is the one thing powerful enough to crack it open.
I feel like we were in a struggle, but we didn't know that we were in a struggle. I feel like when you're in it, sometimes you don't understand until you get out of it. It was just what we knew.
It was never said outright, never explained in detail, but always delivered with a weight that made her stomach turn. The phrase carried too much knowing laughter, too many sideways glances. And whenever she tried to press for clarity, the room would shift, people suddenly changing the subject or dismissing it with a casual, "You'll see." Over time, patterns emerged. Stories whispered late at night, women who showed up confident and ambitious but came back different, quieter, guarded, with a look in their eyes that said more than words ever could. The sessions weren't about vocal control or media coaching. They were about control. Period. Control of bodies, control of loyalty, control of futures. Milan began to realize that what she was overhearing wasn't background noise, it was a language, a coded system spoken fluently by the insiders who knew the rules and enforced them, and silently endured by the ones who didn't have the power to walk away. And as her relationship with Meek pulled her deeper into those rooms, it became harder to ignore the truth. She wasn't just a bystander anymore. She was inside the machine, close enough to feel how it worked, close enough to know what it could do to people who refused to play along. For Milan, the deeper she looked, the darker it got. This wasn't just about whispered rumors or locker room jokes, it was an ecosystem. A system that fed on silence and thrived on the fear of exposure. The young artists who went through these so-called sessions weren't just being tested, they were being marked. Once it happened, you carried it with you. And if you ever tried to step out of line, there were people who could pull the strings, drop a video, or leak a story that would crush your career before it even began. Insiders say Milan's realization hit hardest when she recognized the pattern. It wasn't random who got chosen. It was often women, young, hungry, talented, pulled aside under the guise of opportunity. Promises of studio time, features, industry introductions. And then suddenly, the room would shift, the doors would close, and the training would begin. What made it worse, according to those close to her, was knowing that some of the biggest names in the game weren't just aware of it, they were allegedly participants. The same men fans idolized, the ones who preached empowerment in interviews, were behind the curtain enforcing a code of silence. And Meek. Milan never accused him directly, but she couldn't ignore the fact that he knew the language, knew the players, and had stood in those rooms. It left her with an impossible choice: stay silent and protect her peace, or speak up and risk everything. For years, she chose silence. But now, the weight of what she witnessed, what she pieced together, might finally be too heavy to keep buried.
My mom, she had my sister at 15. She dropped out of high school. She ended up going back and getting her GED, and she went to college to become a registered nurse. And I was telling my followers that because she made that sacrifice, it allowed me to dream. And I said, whoever.
And it started the same way for almost everyone: an invitation you couldn't refuse, a late-night studio call, an after-party at a mansion, a meeting set up by someone you trusted. Once you were in the room, the lines blurred quickly. Drinks poured, cameras out of sight, and people in power watching closely. It wasn't about teaching you how to perform on stage. It was about teaching you how to stay in line. From what Milan allegedly gathered, these sessions were about leverage as much as loyalty. Break someone early, and they'll never forget. Who broke them? Put them in a compromising position, and you own their silence forever. It wasn't just coercion, it was insurance. Something that could be used later if an artist ever dared to rebel. Insiders claim this is why so many promising voices disappear before their time. One wrong move, one refusal, and suddenly the momentum stalls. Opportunities vanish. Careers end before they start. And for those who went along with it, success came with invisible chains, ties to men who smiled in public but ruled in private. For Milan, the phrase training sessions became less of a rumor and more of a shadow hanging over every event, every party, every studio night. She didn't need a full explanation. The fear in people's eyes, the unfinished sentences, and the nervous laughter told her enough. And while she never said Meek was involved, she couldn't shake the thought that he knew. That's what made it unbearable, because in her mind, silence wasn't safety, it was complicity. But behind the scenes were playing an entirely different role. Gatekeepers, not just signing talent, but testing it, bending it, and in some cases, breaking it. These weren't nobodies, these were men with Grammys, plaques on the wall, and names that appear in Billboard every single year. The same people hailed as visionaries on stage were allegedly running rituals offstage that no one dared talk about. And that's the part that shook Milan the most. Because once you know this side of the story, it changes how you see everything else: the sudden fall-offs, the unexplained breakdowns, the artists who rise fast and then move like they're carrying secrets heavier than their fame. According to insiders close to her, Milan wasn't trying to paint herself as a victim of these sessions. She was never forced into one, never dragged into a back room, but she was close enough to see the signs, close enough to hear the whispers, and close enough to realize that silence was the price of survival. And while she never accused Meek of orchestrating or participating, she couldn't ignore the fact that he had been in those circles long enough to know the culture that existed behind the flashing lights. That's what made her own silence feel like complicity, because the further she got into his world, the harder it became to separate love from loyalty, or survival from betrayal. For years, she kept it quiet. She focused on her brand, her baby, her independence. But according to people who know her, Milan is no longer interested in keeping the industry's darkest secrets safe. Not for drama, not for clout, but because she knows women are still walking into those same training sessions. And she doesn't want her silence to be the reason it keeps happening. Take MIA for example. She allegedly endured some of this, and her career went south, down under the weight of her refusal to conform. One minute she was on the biggest stages in the world, nominated for Grammys, headlining festivals, and shaking up the culture with music that didn't sound like anyone else. The next, she was blacklisted, mocked, and written off as difficult. To the public, it looked like she just faded away. But to people who understand the way this industry works, it looked like punishment, a warning. Step out of line, refuse to play the game, and watch how fast the machine turns on you. And she wasn't the only one. Whispers connect similar dots to other artists, those who came in hot, with undeniable talent, but suddenly lost momentum after saying no too many times or asking the wrong questions. Behind closed doors, insiders claim these training sessions were never about making stars. They were about creating leverage. Once you've been compromised, once you've been broken down or made to witness something too dark to repeat, you can be controlled. That's the system Milan allegedly brushed up against. The one that made her realize success in music isn't just about talent or hustle. It's about how much you're willing to endure, how much you're willing to stay silent about, and how much of yourself you're willing to sacrifice. And for someone like her, independent, outspoken, and unwilling to play pont, the cost was too high.
Surgery. I'm not insecure because I would have got plastic surgery. People make it, they all can turn around and thank Beyonce because that's it. And enough is enough. I'm fucking coming for everyone now.
And in that world, silence was its own kind of survival. Insiders say Milan understood that better than anyone. She didn't rant on social media. She didn't drop hints in interviews. She played her part, kept her focus on her brand, and stayed away from the rooms where the whispers were loudest. But just because she didn't speak publicly didn't mean she wasn't keeping track. People close to her say, Milan started noticing patterns: who got the sudden push from labels, who vanished without explanation, and who suddenly seemed to change overnight. To outsiders, it might have looked like normal industry ups and downs. To her, it looked orchestrated, calculated, like a chessboard where the pawns never even knew they were being moved. That's what made it heavy. Because once you understand how the system really works, you can't unsee it. And according to those who know her best, Milan carried that weight even as she built Milano di Rouge into something real and independent. She had her own wins, but always with the shadow of what she'd allegedly witnessed at the edge of her world. And now, years later, with distance from Meek, and with her brand standing on its own, sources say Milan feels safer, or at least safer, than before. Not safe enough to point fingers, not safe enough to drop names, but safe enough to confirm what so many whispers have suggested for decades, that the training sessions weren't rumors, they were routine, a rite of passage that nobody asked for, but too many endured. Which raises the question, if someone like Milan, who wasn't even an artist, could pick up on all of this just by being close, how many others know more, but stay quiet because the price of honesty is too high? Watching them step into the same circles she'd once been in, smiling wide, not knowing what waited behind closed doors. To Milan, it was like déjà vu, only this time, she wasn't the newcomer, she was the observer, and that distance made it harder to stay silent. Friends say she wrestled with the fear of backlash, of losing everything she built, of being targeted by people who had the power to make entire careers vanish overnight. But as she saw more and more young women walk into the trap, her silence began to feel like betrayal. According to insiders, Milan began to confide quietly in people she trusted. Not full exposes, not name-dropping, just cautionary words, subtle warnings. She allegedly told one designer friend, "Don't ever go to a late-night meeting alone. If it feels off, leave." To another, she hinted that success in that world often came with a price no one talked about. She wasn't ready to blow the whistle outright, but those close to her believe she started testing the waters, gauging whether anyone would believe her if she did. And then came the shift. With Diddy's arrest shaking the industry, and with more survivors refusing to stay silent, the air changed. What once would have been dismissed as a conspiracy was now part of the public conversation. That gave Milan something she hadn't had before: cover. If the biggest names in music could be questioned, then maybe people would listen to her too. Still, she's careful. Insiders stress that Milan hasn't come out with names or direct accusations. Instead, she speaks in fragments, cautionary tones, and in the safety of trusted circles. But those same insiders say the fact that she's even willing to talk about it at all is a sign of how much the culture around silence is breaking. The real question now isn't whether Milan knows what goes on, it's whether she's finally ready to bring it into the light, even if it means putting herself at risk. And that's the part that has people in the industry nervous. Milan doesn't have to drop names to be dangerous. The fact that she's even acknowledging the system exists is enough to make insiders sweat. Because once someone credible starts hinting, others who've been holding back often find the courage to step forward too. And unlike anonymous whispers online, Milan comes with receipts, ears in the rooms, connections to some of the biggest names in music, and the kind of first-hand proximity you can't just dismiss as gossip. Friends say she's been intentional with her words, speaking like someone who knows she's being watched, but also like someone who's preparing the ground for something bigger, whether that ends up being an interview, a book, or even just a viral post. The sense is clear: Milan's silence has an expiration date, and when that day comes, it won't just rattle Meek's orbit. It could pull back the curtain on an entire system that's thrived in the dark for decades.
It's a blessing to be fearless. Like, it's a blessing to not fear anything and just know that every obstacle I'm faced with.
Is Ariana Grande's constant reinvention really just artistry, or is it survival? Why do so many young stars burn out before 30? Not from lack of talent, but from something that seems to drain them at the core. These aren't just random breakdowns or coincidences, they fit into a cycle. Sudden fame, unexplained silence, erratic behavior, then carefully staged comebacks. And if you look closer, the fingerprints of control are always there. Heavy management, airtight contracts, NDAs that outlast careers. And whispers about things that never make it to TMZ. Milan's alleged account doesn't just add another story. It ties together threads fans have been tugging at for years. It suggests that what looks like chaos might actually be structure. That what we chalk up to the price of fame may be something far darker, deliberate, and orchestrated. A network of executives, producers, and handlers who all operate by the same unwritten code. They find talent young, test boundaries early, and keep leverage tucked away for later. It's not always about the money, though there's plenty of that. It's about control. Careers, reputations, even mental health become bargaining chips in a game most fans never see. And the more you look at the meltdowns, the sudden silences, the stars who seem like shells of who they once were, the harder it is to write it all off as coincidence. Maybe it's not fame that changes them. Maybe it's what fame demands, and what's demanded behind closed doors that breaks them. And that control doesn't stop once the spotlight hits. According to Whispers, it follows artists throughout their careers. The photos, the footage, the whispered stories, they hang over everything. You want to renegotiate a contract? Better remember what's on file. Thinking about switching labels? Someone might suddenly leak a scandal. Even the most confident stars can find themselves trapped. Forced to smile in public while privately knowing their freedom isn't real. To outsiders, it looks like the price of fame is pressure, exhaustion, and media scrutiny. But insiders claim, the real cost is obedience cemented through rituals nobody ever admits exist. Yet too many people describe the same way for it all to be coincidence. Was blind to what was happening. If anything, her position as a designer gave her a unique vantage point. She wasn't the talent desperate for a deal, nor the executive pulling strings. She was adjacent. Close enough to see the power plays without being fully trapped in them, and that perspective made the patterns stand out. The same rooms, the same people, the same coded language. Whispers of opportunities that seemed to come with hidden costs. Watching it unfold, Milan allegedly realized the game wasn't just about music, it was about control. And the chilling part, it wasn't random, it was systematic. Silenced like so many before her remains to be seen. What's clear though, is that Milan's story adds another layer to the growing chorus of accounts hinting at the same machination, industry where access is currency, and compliance is the price of admission. If she continues down this path, even carefully, she forces a question most people would rather avoid. How much of what we celebrate as entertainment is really just performance? And how many stars are shining under contracts written in fear, leverage, and silence rather than ink? Because if the whispers are true, then fame as we know it isn't free. It's a transaction, negotiated not only in boardrooms and studios, but in dimly lit spaces where the cameras are off, and the real decisions are made. The dream of making it big becomes less about talent and more about how much a person is willing to tolerate, what they're willing to swallow, and how much of themselves they can erase to survive. Think about the patterns. Artists emerge overnight with dazzling potential, voices, charisma, stories that resonate, but somewhere along the line, the spark fades. They become less themselves, more a product. Some spiral into breakdowns, others retreat into silence, while a select few climb even higher, but with eyes that no longer shine the same. To the public, it looks like the natural toll of celebrity. To insiders, it's often explained as the weight of secrets. Milan's position makes her account uniquely unsettling. She wasn't a singer chasing a record deal, or an actress hoping for her first big role. She was adjacent, present in the spaces but not dependent on them for survival. That vantage point gave her a kind of shield, but also clarity. She could observe the shifts without being pulled fully into the machinery. According to those close to her, what she saw was enough to convince her that the system wasn't accidental, it was orchestrated. And that system, if you connect the dots, extends far beyond any one label, city, or genre. Hollywood has its whispers. Fashion has its rumors. Even sports, politics, and tech have seen parallel accusations of gatekeeping through exploitation. What makes the entertainment industry so powerful however, is its visibility. It sells dreams, culture, identity. It wraps exploitation in glitter and soundtracks it with chart-topping hits. By the time the truth peeks through, the damage is already done. And the audience is too busy dancing to notice. The danger for Mill and anyone else considering speaking out is obvious. These aren't powerless individuals being accused. They are moguls with decades of influence, billion-dollar corporations with armies of lawyers, and networks built on favors and silence. Taking one on doesn't just risk career suicide, it can ripple into personal safety. History shows this clearly. Promising artists vanish from charts. Public meltdowns get sensationalized until credibility is gone, and survivors are dismissed as bitter or unstable. The machine doesn't just silence, it rewrites narratives. But history also shows another side. Every major reckoning, from Hollywood's #MeToo movement to high-profile lawsuits in music, began with one or two voices breaking formation. At first, they were doubted. Then more came forward. Suddenly, what once seemed impossible to prove became undeniable. The question is whether Milan's voice, cautious as it is, could add momentum to a shift already underway. Because people are beginning to ask harder questions. Why do so many stars burn out young? Why do scandals disappear so cleanly after settlements? Why do careers rise and fall, not with talent, but with invisible tides controlled by unseen hands? And perhaps most damning, why do we, the public, keep accepting the surface story when the patterns scream otherwise? This isn't about conspiracy theories, it's about connecting patterns of behavior that repeat across decades. When lawsuits echo each other, when survivors' accounts mirror one another despite coming from different eras and different parts of the industry, it stops being coincidence. It becomes evidence of a structure, a culture, a system that thrives, because no one with enough visibility dares to say it out loud. That's why Milan's shift matters. Even without names or specifics, her framing places a spotlight where it's most uncomfortable, on the culture itself. By acknowledging what she allegedly witnessed, she validates years of hushed accounts from artists whose credibility was destroyed the moment they spoke. And in doing so, she pushes the conversation beyond gossip into something harder to ignore, a pattern too consistent, too global, to be written off as individual misfortune. Still, the risk remains. If she continues, she likely faced the same strategies used against others: character assassination, legal intimidation, social media manipulation. But there's also power in timing. The industry is more fragile now than it's ever been. Social platforms give survivors direct access to audiences. Independent media outlets amplify stories that mainstream ones once buried. And most importantly, audiences are more skeptical. After scandal, the public no longer assumes the official story is the full one. So where does this leave us? Maybe Milan becomes another silenced footnote. A cautionary tale of someone who spoke too soon, too softly, and was drowned out by the machine. Or maybe she becomes part of a growing crack in the wall, one voice among many building toward a collapse of silence. Either way, her story forces us to look at our relationship with entertainment differently. Every song streamed, every ticket bought, every award celebrated what invisible cost came with it. How many careers were shaped not by artistry, but by coercion? And how much of what we love was built not on creativity, but on compliance? These are uncomfortable questions, but maybe that's the point. If Milan's quiet defiance does anything, it's this. It strips away the illusion that the industry is just about talent, hustle, and luck. It reminds us that behind the lights, behind the stages, behind the music, there are contracts written in fear, power traded in silence, and stars shining under conditions the public will never fully see. And if that's the truth, then the story isn't about Milan at all. It's about what we're willing to believe, what we're willing to ignore, and whether we're ready to face the reality that the entertainment we consume may be the prettiest mask ever worn by one of the ugliest systems alive. And that's the part that makes people uncomfortable. Not just the idea of what might happen behind closed doors, but the possibility that the songs they dance to, the tours they save up for, the idols they worship were all shaped by a system built on compromise. If Milan's careful words are even half true, then the industry's biggest open secret isn't just about who makes it, but about what they had to give up to get there.